from across the globe, from the centre of aerospace. And now to you.
Thank you for downloading the Aero Society podcast from the Royal Aeronautical Society.
Note to self, create a much less complicated CV than we've done all the time. I'll ask William, can you have the lights down here? Yeah. I don't need to deal. This is going to be one of those lectures where I'm as interested to hear what I'm going to say as you are, because it's a little while since I've given this one. I used to give these lectures in my sleep, so I don't script them anymore, but I haven't done it for a little while, so I'll be making it up as I go along. I've asked William to leave this slide up. It's not part of my presentation, but it is actually a photograph that got me into an awful lot of trouble. We had a lecture at 4 Hamilton Place, literally only Tuesday before last, from the current commanding officer of Mara, whose call sign is CAB. And he explained that his call sign was CAB right at the beginning of the talk because he was a Harrier GR7 pilot doing his first refuelling sortie, got a little bit too close to the basket, put an S curve into the hose, so he pushed the hose so it took the tension off the hose, which then whipped, took off the refuelling nozzle, and the next thing he knew, there was a huge bang, and he was actually flying with no canopy at 30,000 feet. And so became known for bringing back a cabriolet Harrier ever since. His call sign has been CAB. So I thought, well, I'll take a lead from this place. I'll tell you how I got into trouble. So this picture, if any of you are avid Daily Mirror readers, this picture actually was the front page of the Daily Mirror in 2000, captioned by the headline, "We rescue top secret fighter laptop computer." Guess whose computer that was? I had been over here giving a lecture for the Royal Aeronautical Society. That was the screensaver on my laptop, which was stolen on the Heathrow Express, sold to the Daily Mirror for £15,000, and they subsequently ran a headline, and I managed to be on the front page of the Daily Mirror for 3 days. And if any of you remember what happened to Hugh Grant around 2000, I have never been so grateful for somebody for the inspiration when he took me on the front page. Okay, can we go to the main lecture? No, that's not me. This is what happens when you let somebody mess with your computer. Okay, and I need the clicker, please. We've got. So, there are very few people who have the privilege. I'm hugely privileged to be president of the Royal Aeronautical Society. There have been a few times in my life where I've suddenly found myself doing things that I never ever thought I'd be doing. One was probably the day that I got a phone call from First Sea Lord saying that I was going to be selected for Admiral. That was definitely not in the cards. Second one was when I found myself doing Joint Strike Fighter, because that was as much fun as you can have with your clothes on. I think you're allowed to say that, you see. And the third one was finding myself as president of the Royal Aeronautical Society. And it is a huge privilege to be able to be here to represent the 24,000 members of the society. But I've also been very, very lucky in some of the things I've done, and the highlight of my career has been JSF. So I want you all to just sort of close your eyes and imagine yourself back to 1999. So imagine me with black hair and some hair. I actually was cut this short because I was working in America. A bit slimmer. The state-of-the-art device was a BlackBerry. iPhones didn't exist. And we were inventing an aeroplane. And I had been doing future logistics support for the Fleet Air Arm for about 20 months. And that had got, because I was an ex-Harrier engineer, that had got me into being interested in advising the MOD on the Joint Strike Fighter program. And the opportunity came up to go out and lead the small team of 10 people in the UK, or from the UK, who were out in the Washington office. And I flew out there with my family and took over that team. And we were still in the requirements phase, so the job of the program at that time was to write the requirements and refine them through a series of studies, which I'll talk about in a minute, and do a series of technology demonstrations, as part of which each of the two competing main aircraft manufacturers, Boeing and Lockheed, had to build demonstrator aircraft. And I'll talk about the objectives of demonstrator aircraft in a minute. But to give you some idea of the speed of that program and the excitement at the time, when I first went out, I think I'd been out there for about 2 and a bit weeks, and I flew out to Indianapolis to the Rolls-Royce factory out there, where they were running for the first time the lift fan, which is what makes the F-35 go vertical. So it's a 48-inch diameter, 2-stage fan with contra-rotating sets of compressors, effectively. This thing was sitting in a corrugated shed out the back of the factory, hooked up to a 50-gallon oil drum. And they started up, and I think when I got there, it had been running for 3 days, or they were on the 3rd day of having runs. And it was emptying the oil drum in 2 and a bit minutes. Now, being a helicopter man, I'm kind of used to things that swim in oil, but this was oil even for a helicopter. Basically what they had discovered was that if you have large gears, there's a big gearbox in the centre, because that deals with making the 2 stages contra-rotate. If you then spray oil onto that to do your splash lubrication, if they're big gears, they just throw the oil out to the side with such a force that it was running up the side of the gearbox, overcoming all the oil seals on the top and coming out of the top of the gearbox. And it was going through about 50 gallons of oil in 2 minutes. And we were at that stage, by the program that we were running then, we were 8 months away from flying that in an aeroplane. And I thought, no pilot in his right mind is going to sit in and strap himself to something with that sitting right behind him, not least because pilots don't like getting their hands dirty. We didn't fly in 8 months. We did fly in 12 months, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But the pace of that program was just unbelievable, and the excitement. And it was really, really nice to hear the presentation from the commanding officer at Marham last week. 9 aeroplanes now in the UK, and the excitement at Marham is every bit as high, and the enthusiasm is every bit as live as now at Marham as it was back in that program then. It's a hugely exciting program. And it's the only time in my life that I actually, when the aircraft came to react 2 years ago for the first time, and it did its flight display, did the hover display, so I sat in the hover for about 2 minutes doing the normal sort of Harrier-like manoeuvres. It's not that good at bowing because the control system doesn't run itself quite as well as a Harrier did, but whatever. But just about the point where a Harrier would have been running on fumes and it would have just landed, and the pilot would have been a bit scratchy because he really was running low, this thing then transitioned away from the hover, back into forward flight, did a full circuit, went to another hover pad, hovered again and landed. And I could not speak for 5 minutes because I wrote the requirement for it to be able to do that. It's the only time in my life I've actually been right in the beginning of the program, written a requirement. It was specifically because I had a Harrier pilot on my team who had been on one of the squadrons with me, and at certain conditions in the Sea Harrier, you had enough fuel and enough hover thrust to be able to come to the hover alongside the ship. If the deck was foul, you just had enough fuel to get away into the ejection envelope and pull the yellow and black exit handle, because you could not hover with enough fuel in particular temperature and pressure conditions. And we said we are not going to have a new generation aeroplane that does that. So we wrote the requirement that the aircraft had to be able to hover alongside the deck. If the deck was foul, transition away, do another circuit, come back, hover again, land, and have 5 minutes taxi. Now, it actually cost a fortune in the program because in the end they had to stop the program for about a year to take weight out of the Stovall aeroplane in order for it to be able to do that. But I'm absolutely convinced it was the right thing to do. And what an incredible experience to actually write something and then 15 years later see it perform for real. It's just the privilege of being in aviation, one of those that doesn't go away. So let's talk a little bit about the program. These slides will well, I'm happy for the slides to go on the website or whatever you want to do afterwards. They're all picked up from public release documents, with the exception of the videos, which are some of my private ones, or some of them are anyway. But you won't be able to put those up anyway. So that's fine. So let's talk about some of the cleverness of JSF was the people who thought up the program in the first place, the whole construct of the program. It wasn't just buy an aeroplane. It was an attempt to break the Augustine's curve, where Norm Augustine predicted that if you followed the expense curve of aeroplanes from the 1950s through to the late 80s, by I think he said it was 2050, we'd get to the point where even the US would be able to afford one aeroplane, because they were just getting exponentially more and more expensive. And this aeroplane was designed to try and break that cost curve. Now, it's arguable to what extent it succeeded. It certainly is not on the exponential curve, but it's probably not as low as they had hoped. But one of the ways they wanted to do it was to make sure that you could build three variants. CV is the carrier variant, so for operating off big deck carriers with catapults and arrestor gear. So it's got a strengthened nose wheel, bigger wing to allow low speed approaches, different control systems. It's actually got extra control systems for low speed approach, and a hook. CTOL is the conventional aircraft, conventional takeoff and landing, so it's essentially an F-16 replacement. It's a big engine that the pilot straps himself to, and the rest of it's more or less a wrapper to wrap around the avionics to get it airborne. And then the STOVL aircraft, short takeoff, vertical landing, for the Marine Corps, and at the time the UK. You'll be aware probably that along the way the UK strayed away from STOVL, has gone back to it now, to replace the Harrier on the smaller ships. Now, obviously the Royal Navy has been lucky enough to have a bigger carrier now, but we stayed with STOVL for very, very good reasons. So that was the core aeroplane program, but in order to break that cost capability curve, there was also a whole piece about global sustainment. So the whole network for sustaining the aeroplane, the way that it's supported, the way that it's maintained, the way that it actually predicts when it's going to go wrong, the way it actually transmits data on its health, not all the time that it's flying, or when at least when it's not in a stealthy condition, was part of the design. So you've got to it's not just the cost of the aeroplane that you need to get out, it's the through-life cost as well. There's more work to do on that. And the nations are currently on a big effort to actually try and drive that cost down. And it was done on a tri-service in the US, and actually it's as hard to get the three services in the US to cooperate as it is to get two countries to cooperate. So getting the US Marine Corps, the US Air Force, and the US Navy to agree on a requirement was a massive, massive step forward. It's never been successfully done before. And it's been very, very successful at this time. All the services actually love the aeroplane. And it set out to be. Now, when I went out in 1999, it was US-UK, but we were just bringing the international partners on. And this slide goes back to that sort of time. So some of those international partners have sort of strayed off a little bit. Whether they'll come back or not, I'm not sure. So Canada's not quite sure what it wants yet. Belgium is still undecided. But most of the rest of them now are heavily involved and are getting aeroplanes. So the Netherlands have got aeroplanes. Italy are just getting some. The first Turkish ones are, I'm not sure if they've been delivered or not yet, but they're built. They're just waiting to sort out the politics. And then right from the beginning, there were two teams. I'm just trying to look for the Boeing team, but there was Team JSF over there with Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce, and then the Boeing team was called One Team, and that was Boeing, also Rolls-Royce, and Raytheon on the radar side. So it was a whole program. It wasn't just an aeroplane program. And this was the timeline of the program. Now, one of the things that, having been in the MOD through the time of what was called then smart acquisition, there was this huge study that said we never ever spend enough up front before we commit to a program. We never do the risk reduction. Good program management says you should spend at least 15% of the overall development cost before you commit to the final solution. And I think the figure for the MOD typically was between 3 and 5%. This program, again, set out to change that. So all this work that's in the red and the grey here was that risk reduction piece. So there was a piece, let's see if I can make this work, a piece on the top which was evolving the requirement, and we did the requirement in 3 phases. You can see here, start with an initial requirements document. So that starts with quite a big envelope. It's almost, do you want a fighter, do you want a bomber, those sorts of decisions. And then through a series of studies of matching different characteristics, different parameters, we gradually honed in. So there's a balance in any aeroplane. At the time, the Americans were just starting to fly the F-32. The previous stealth aeroplane to that had been 117. Now, the 117 aeroplane was incredibly stealthy, but was an absolute nightmare to maintain, and actually was not terribly adaptable, because you had, in order to maintain the signature, you had to fly it more or less in straight lines. So part of the consideration, for instance, and it's just one of the considerations that was done in this study block here, was what's the balance between the signature of the aeroplane, and therefore how close you want to be able to get to the enemy, the accuracy of the avionics and the weapon system, so that you can actually stand off but still make sure that you can put the bomb through, you can choose the window the bomb's going through, and then the accuracy and the capability of the weapon. And those 3 effectively give you, you can either go right up close and almost drop it straight off and through the window, or, but you need a very stealthy aeroplane to do so, and there is a good chance you'll lose the aircraft anyway. Or you go to the other extreme and you stand 200 miles off and put a cruise missile in, where you then don't get probably real-time targeting, and you probably won't get much accuracy, so you just need a big weapon which potentially has a lot of collateral damage. But we did all those studies to actually work out what's the right balance for stealth, and stealth, more stealth costs money, so there's an affordability piece in there. What's the right range for the avionics to be able to sense and give a target solution, and then what are the right weapons to actually deliver at that range. And that was all this activity here of a series of gradually refining the space for the design of the aircraft down to what we wanted. Supporting that, there were a number of technologies, and you get used to, if you work in an American office, or particularly in the military, you get used to these ghastly words, technology maturation. These were the technology maturation programs, and they decided very early on where they needed to really focus efforts to make sure that the next generation aircraft was both affordable, maintainable, but maintaining its lethal side and its survivability. So you can see there, structures and materials was all about very lightweight structures and maintainable, low observable material. Flight systems was primarily about flight control systems, an awful lot of which actually came from the UK. So this is one of these things that's what's going on at the moment. The reason the UK was right up there as a #1 partner was we had invested in technologies, in particular technology for advanced STOVL aeroplanes. And that piece of technology, the flight control system, which was developed at Boscombe Down here, was a key way of getting entry and getting credibility. And the other side was the low-cost manufacturing and the agile manufacturing that is all featured within the Typhoon program, which BAE Systems at Wharton had commissioned. And that both of those allowed BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce to play a major part into this program, and therefore, and because of the UK government's part of that, then for the UK to become what they call the only level 1 partner. So if there were 3 main American partners, the US Air Force, the US Marine Corps, the US Navy, The fourth equal partner to that was the UK. So although it was an office of 250 people and we only had 10 people, we had a 25% say in the requirement for this aeroplane. And there's something that is really, really important with what's going on now in defence, where the Future Combat Air Study and the announcements at Farnborough of Project Tempest are to make sure that UK industry and the UK MOD has enough expert knowledge and enough technology in its pocket to be able to be a credible player. Otherwise, we'll just get ignored. So these were the, and just to give you some idea, the mission systems, there was a competition in this phase run for the radar. And it's an ESA radar, so active electronically scanned array. Basically, the radar antenna doesn't move, it's just a flat plate. And you steer the beam in the radar by, there's 12,000 transmit-receive cells, and by changing the timing of each cell firing, it steers the beam. It actually allows you to do something on one half of the array and something else on the other, so you could be jamming while you're actually tracking. The technology maturation program to develop that was £650 million. So that's almost a program in UK terms. That was just for the radar. And that's the sort of thing that you can do if you're doing stuff at this scale. And then right in the middle, the two chosen manufacturers, and they're down-selected from a larger number, but they're down to Boeing and Lockheed by this stage, had to develop their own concepts. And the concepts had to demonstrate primarily that their propulsion concept worked, but also they had to demonstrate commonality. So I mentioned before, there are three variants, the CTOL, CV, Stonewall. They were only allowed to build 2 demonstrators. And one of those demonstrators had to demonstrate both variants, which meant it had to be convertible. And that was a way of driving that commonality into the system. And then this was the plan, slightly optimistic. So bear in mind, this was 1999. They thought they would start entering production about 2010. They actually started production in 2012 and delivered the first aircraft in 2014. So actually, for a fighter program, it stayed as close as any fighter program probably ever has, stand past some of the black programs. But it was, and a lot of that was because of the risk reduction that had gone on here. So we talked about that. 2 teams for the concept demonstrator. Boeing doing the X-32, A, B, and C. So A is the CTOL variant, B is the Stonewall variant, C is the CV variant. And Boeing decided that they would demonstrate I'm going to get this right, the B and the C using the same aeroplane. And Lockheed Martin decided that they would use the A aircraft to do the initial testing and then convert it to B by putting the lift fan in, and I'll explain that in a minute. So already there was a difference in philosophy. And the first emergence of one of the things, there's an awful lot of people that say, well, it was obvious from the beginning which one was going to win, because one of those two is not very pretty. But there we are, 2 aircraft per team. They had to demonstrate the preferred weapon system concept, as that was called, to satisfy demonstration objectives. So commonality for an affordable family. So of a family of 3 types of aircraft, they were looking to try and get at least 85% commonality between each of those aeroplanes. It's a little bit lower than that now, it's around 70, but it's still a significant amount. It means you can manufacture them and build them on the same production lines. You had to demonstrate short takeoff, vertical landing, hover, and transition from one to the other. And you had to demonstrate slow seed carrier approach flying and handling qualities, because when you go to the extremes of the 3 variants, the CTOL aeroplane is even the Jaguar used to get airborne, largely due to the curvature of the Earth. It wasn't actually flying, it just, the Earth got away from it. This had to, the extremes were, can you make a STOVL aircraft hover, and can you transition it into forward flight, and can you get down to a low enough speed and still control the aircraft to conduct a carrier approach on the CV variant. And so this was the concept, that it was a family of 3 aircraft that had a common core engine, a common main fuselage, and a completely common mission suite, and that they have achieved. So the 3 aircraft have a common mission suite. And then as you got towards the end of building this common aeroplane, you then started to go off to put the stoval bits in to make it a stoval aeroplane for the Marine Corps, and put the bigger wings, bigger tails, bigger horizontal tails for the Navy to actually make it controllable for the carrier approach. And that was the concept. And as I say, when you look back, all these slides date from 1999, and the whole program has really been true to those principles. So, I'll start with the ugly one. This is the stoval version of the Boeing aircraft. Boeing chose, because if you think of your history, when the Americans bought the Harrier and went to the AV-8B, the more modern Harrier, it was actually done through Boeing. So it was a cooperation between BAE Systems and Boeing. So Boeing had considerable direct lift expertise. Direct lift being you just take the air that's coming out the back of the engine, a la Harrier, and you turn it down, and you blow a lot of hot air, very noisy hot air as well, downwards to make it hover. In order to do that, you need a large engine, because in low-speed conditions, i.e. hover, hot air coming out the back of the engine is very inefficient in its propulsive efficiency. What you want in a slow speed is a lot of air going a bit slower and ideally being a bit cooler. Direct lift doesn't really allow you to do that, and it was one of the major constraints of this aeroplane. But this is the B aircraft. Interestingly, they needed that. This is a flat intake now, which is there for the hover condition. They actually never got to the point where they would have been able to go supersonic with this aeroplane, because that would have been just like a brick wall. In order to make it go supersonic, they would have had to put a lip on there. So there were some things they weren't able to demonstrate. But nonetheless, it was a very successful aeroplane, and by a day or two, it was actually the first of the two to fly. Just to give you some idea, the concept is that when the aircraft's in up and away flight, air obviously goes in the front, and it just purely acts as a normal jet, all the air is exhausted out the back. So it's not like Harrier, where the air comes out the side. It all went straight through the engine and straight out the back. The clever bit was, when it came to actually hover, it closed off the back of the engine. These were folding nozzles, which opened, the doors open, the nozzles fold out, and there are butterfly valves in the engine, which then the air is then redirected. Now, I'm an engineer and I'm already twitching when I'm saying it, when you're trying to switch high pressure flows, but redirected now to come out of these nozzles. So it was this was the primary the vertical lift component. So, and there is the engine. The manufacturers were told they had to use the Pratt & Whitney 119 engine, which is the engine out of the F-22, as the core. So this engine from that bit forward is the same engine, whether it was a Lockheed aircraft or it was a Boeing aircraft, and whether it was STOVL, CTOL or CV. The Boeing specific bits, which Rolls-Royce did, were these. Now, if you're a Harrier person, these are the equivalent to the elephant's trousers, or a ruder term if you're in the Navy, with either the coming to the bottom, come out the back when it was in up and away flight, and there was a nozzle on the back of the aircraft that would close that off. You can just see inside there the large butterfly valves, which are what open to allow the flow to the nozzles. So when you were doing the transition, you would open those butterfly valves, you would close the back of the engine, and the air would come out of these. Now, there were also ducts to do balance fore and aft, so you could actually manage pitch, but primarily this was the main lift component. So this is a this is a personal video that I have. I apologise for bear in mind it's a 1999 technology. This is actually doing the first time it did the in-flight conversion to STOVL.
Well, it was a great flight today. We took off this morning, climbed to 9,000 feet, deployed the lift system for the first time in flight, and switched to our still flight control odds. And then towards the end of the flight, we went ahead and did our flow switch transition.
So there's the nozzle at the back. They've got the nozzles unfolded, doors open, So there's no flow through those at the moment.
It was transparent to me that I actually had switched from conventional to stowable mode.
There we are. So now close off the back of the engine, open up the butterfly valves, and the aircraft's now in stowable mode.
Aircraft fit for roll transits and all. Very easy to get in and out of stowable, and very easy to get in and out of cruise nozzle and lift nozzle.
And the nozzles then move fore and aft to give you velocity control, just like a Harrier.
Cruise nozzle pulls down, and the lift nozzle butterfly valves open in less than 3 seconds, which is exactly what we designed it to do. The whole deployment of the lift system and the flow switch from cruise to lift nozzle took place in less than 6 seconds. And that's really important because that demonstrates the operational flexibility of our system. That's one of the key advantages of a direct lift system is that the workload is low. The mode switching should be transparent to the pilot, which it was today.
I don't know if you caught that comment. As he opened up the size of the 119 engine, as he opened up the back nozzle, it was an F-18 was actually was doing the flying chase, couldn't stay with it. The F-18 was in full burner and couldn't stay with the X-32 as it accelerated away as they just opened up that back nozzle. The power of the engine, it's a 40,000 pound thrust engine. You kind of know if you're anywhere near it when it's operating. Okay, and this was the X-35, which is remarkably similar to the F-35 that we now have. A very different concept, and the main difference is in the stowable mode, where it uses in up and away flight, as you can see it there, and that's the A, so that's in conventional flight. But on the shoulder of just behind there, sitting vertically in the fuselage is a lift fan, which when you come to the hover, you'll see in a minute, the doors open, top and bottom, the lift fan clutches in, spools up, and then you actually split the 40,000 pounds of thrust. So you've got 20,000 pounds coming out the back and 20,000 pounds coming out of the lift fan. Give you some idea of the complexity of the lift fan, and I had the privilege of running that program for Rolls-Royce. It's a 2-stage fan with a gearbox in the middle that just makes them contra-rotating. Each of the fan blisks, as they're called, are a single piece of titanium. They're not made as a single piece, but they're actually welded together. Hollow fan blades, so they're ultra lightweight, very, very strong. And the lift fan, with no fuel going in, produces more thrust than a Eurofighter EJ200 engine in reheat. So it's a fantastic piece of, I'm really pleased to say, British engineering. There is the lift fan, to give you some idea of the size of it. This was an early version, so the actual nozzle, this piece here, is no longer part of the lift fan. It's now integrated into the fuselage. So this is effectively what does area control on the bottom of the nozzle and directional control. And it's still made by Rolls-Royce, but it's built into the airframe. So it's effectively, from there upwards, is now the nozzle changing it. But this is converting, so the aircraft, this photograph I've just shown you was the aircraft flying without the lift fan in, demonstrating all the flight conditions for the X-35A, the CTOL aeroplane. And then they took it down for no more than 6 weeks, put the lift fan and all the associated systems in, and then took it back flying. And the X-35, I've mentioned the fact that the 32, because of the intake conditions, it would do vertical stuff, or it would do slow speed with that intake on. If they wanted to do high speed, they had to put a lip on it. Not the same with the X-35. The X-35, this is Mission X, the first aeroplane to ever take off on a short takeoff, so using the nozzles to get airborne, go supersonic, and come back and land vertically. And it is better looking. So there you can see the doors are open on the back there, just behind the pilot, so the lift fan's engaged, the nozzles, the three bearing swivel nozzle at the back is down, very short takeoff. Into burner, now going supersonic. Now, it does actually use quite a lot of gas when you're doing that, so just to prove it, they went and took a suck of gas. Supersonic again. Now you can see the three bearing swivel nozzle at the back of the aircraft is actually rotated through 90 degrees, so the thrust from the back is coming out vertically, and then it's supported in the front by the lift fan. That's the outlet from the lift fan coming down. I'll talk about those doors in a minute, and about the pilots that flew these aircraft, because these were test pilots absolutely earning their money as test pilots. It looks very simple. In actual fact, there was some very, very skilled flying going on there. So you can see the way that the nozzle moves to actually give you yaw control and velocity control, and then the landing. So let's talk a little bit about those doors as just one of the aspects. I'm just trying to think what the next slide is. Okay, I'll come on and talk about the 136 engine in a minute. When they actually designed that, you'll see the doors they had on that aircraft were like piano doors that opened up either side of the lift fan. What they actually discovered in that piece of flight, and you'll see when you see if you see the operation of the aircraft now, it's got a big one-piece door that opens up behind the lift fan. It's called the toilet seat for obvious reasons. Single piece of superplastic formed diffusion bonded titanium. The doors look like a really neat solution, except that when you're drawing huge volumes of air in and they're coming up over the side of the aircraft, the hinge points for the piano hinges on the doors, effectively, were creating little swirls, which were then going down into the engine and giving a rotating stall. And if you maintain the engine at that condition, you had about 2 minutes of fan life total. So the pilots actually had to fly that aircraft manually right through that condition the whole time. Now there were some people in the JSF office that knew. I didn't at the time, because clearly it wasn't in Lockheed's interest to be too loud about it. But it was an extraordinarily skilled piece of flying by a chap called Simon Hargreaves, who's actually at the time was BAE Systems Stowell lead test pilot, and actually happened to be he was the senior pilot when I was on 800 squadron with Harriers. The alternative engine was actually, for a while, the US government funded, although the Pratt & Whitney engine was the lead engine, they funded a second engine program, because one of the things they'd had in the past was that where they had a single engine variant for a large fleet, in this case it was the F-16 with the Pratt & Whitney engine, they found that they weren't getting the responsiveness from the manufacturer to correct problems with it. And they wanted to make sure that because this fleet's going to be 3,000 aircraft for the US, they didn't want to have a single engine that if they had a major engine problem, effectively the whole of their combat air capability was taken down. And B, they wanted to make sure they used competition to keep the the engine manufacturers on edge. And this was the alternate engine, which was actually about 30% UK made. So Rolls-Royce actually, all this front piece is all Rolls-Royce's technology with hollow blissed fan blades, very, very high capability fans, and there are a few other bits that were Rolls as well. Regrettably, 3 years into the programme, there was some fairly interesting politics went on, and they cancelled this engine when it was about, out of a $4.5 billion programme, it was about 800 million short of being finished, and it got cancelled, so it never happened. And I would say this because I was a Rolls-Royce person and it was my engine. It was a better engine had we been able to see that one through. But nonetheless, the UK still got a huge amount out of it. And that is, to give you some idea of the scale of testing on this programme, That's a 136. Unfortunately, we haven't got a person on there. A person was, if they were stood there, the head would have been to about there. So that gives you some idea of the size of the engine. So simulating the twin intakes with a smooth airflow condition and the 3-bearing swivel nozzle on the back. And it's worth just concentrating a bit on that 3-bearing swivel nozzle because it's what we have today. This is the nozzle that actually is capable of, it does area control and looks after afterburner. If any of you are aware of the complexities of afterburner, they're very temperamental things. So area management is really important with the nozzle back here. But these slices here they contra-rotate and basically allow, just by geometry, the nozzle to actually turn through 90 degrees. Now, you might think that's simple. That looks like that should just be a 45-degree cut and a 45-degree cut. Actually, for this to work, because bear in mind you've got 20,000 pounds of thrust coming through this, so the axial forces on these bearings that are doing the swiveling is huge. They're ceramic bearings to maintain the temperature and understand the pressure, and therefore they're very intolerant of any inconsistencies. So what you actually have to do, the only way these are going to work is if actually in that 45-degree plane they're completely circular, which means that the section of the 3-bearing swivel nozzle is actually an ovaloid, or whatever the right word is, that makes it so it's circular at 45 degrees, but it's not circular at 90 degrees. And developing that and delivering the tolerances on that was a massive, massive issue for Rolls-Royce. And we were doing them externally in the UK still, but in the end, we brought them back in-house, and they're now built at Bristol. And they're put together with electron beam welding, and the tolerances come out to less than a thou out of round, or out of the right shape, as you go around these big nozzles. It's another incredible piece of UK manufacturing. So, put me back into grey hair, bring us right back up to date. The aeroplane is now at sea. This is US Marine Corps and the UK practicing on a US Marine Corps deck. You'll note they have a flat deck, so they're more constrained. The UK will be operating the aircraft off ski jumps, but that's the aircraft at sea. This is, if anybody's used to Harrier recoveries, this is like a Harrier recovery with probably a little bit more noise, but not too much more, and a landing that any Harrier pilot would dream of. So hover alongside the ship, come over the deck, now at about that point on a Harrier, you chop the throttle and it just drops onto the deck. That, with this aircraft, you can control it all the way down. And you can see now, there's the toilet seat, I'll move on a bit. That was the back, I had to steal that video from somewhere. More recently now, the carrier aircraft, the CV aircraft, has now reached operational capability, or is doing its final operational assessment with the US Navy. So these are F-18s on board, I think it's the Carl Vincent, and there's a JSF Lightning landing.
This is the first time we've put F-35 on the flight deck with any other aircraft. It's the first time we've operated F-35 in a civil ops environment. So the main mission of us with the X-9, VFA 125, and VFA 101 while on board here is to test the F-35 in a civil ops environment and see how it performs. So for me, the biggest transition I had to make, like I said, was a two-seat pilot. So obviously the F-35 is not like the other two-seat aircraft. So I had to transition from being a two-seat pilot, the TCC concept, to being a single-seat pilot. So that was a transition for myself. And obviously it's a brand new airplane built by a completely different company. So a lot of the mission systems are different. So you're learning, just basically having to learn a whole new airplane was probably the biggest transition.
So my job also is basically for the safe recovery of aircraft on board the aircraft carrier. So what I do is I go on the LSO platform and basically wave all the planes to come in and land and make sure that they're safe, they're realistic properly, and grade them and get them aboard the aircraft carrier. This current squadron is on board the ship really divided by 3 squadrons. So we have the X-9, VFA 101, VFA 125, and one member and this squadron basically is only coming together for this one, but the F-35 has basically, there's not a ceiling on it right now, it just keep going. The F-35 is, well, I'm a car guy now, I compare it to, it seems kind of like a classic car, you know, it's tried and true, it's been around for a long time. And the F-35 is kind of more like one of the newer modern cars, a lot more software based. It's a lot better in many ways, more advanced, easier to handle, a lot more user friendly. So the F-35 is really good for this price.
Good to know they still play hooligans at sea. Okay, and then just bringing it into the today, this is HMS Queen Elizabeth going into Portsmouth for the first time. You've all been following, including, I've no doubt, the 6 drunken sailors who managed to get themselves arrested, tased. I hope the Navy leaves them there. The days, it used to be the days that behaviour was acceptable, and you used to go and rescue them from the jails. I don't think it's acceptable anymore, and as I say, I just hope they leave them to rot. But the ship has now sailed. It's docked in Mayport and is due to come out very shortly. And the first F-35 landings will be happening literally in the next few days. So very soon, the UK will be back into fixed-wing aviation at sea, big time. And if I could sign up, I'd be there in a heartbeat. This literally was 2 days old. US Marine Corps have got the aircraft deployed on operations. This is 4 F-35B, so the Stowell aircraft, somewhere out near Japan, in formation 2 days ago. Any questions? Yeah.
What do you think your competition is from other countries?
This is what they call a Gen 5 aeroplane. So they talk about different generations. Gen 4 is Eurofighter. Gen 4 was all about agility, very highly agile aircraft with quite advanced weapon systems. Gen 5 is stealth, low observability, and extraordinarily highly capable radar systems. We did the testing on the radar of this aircraft, so I'm an ex-Sea Harrier guy. The Blue Vixen radar was regarded as probably state-of-the-art when I was at sea with it in the early 90s. And we had about a 350-hour MTBF on those radars, so about every 350 hours something went wrong. We stopped testing this at 12,000 hours because it just doesn't break. There are no moving parts. It's all, and anybody that knows anything about radars, the stuff that breaks is either the moving parts or where you're using radar frequency, so high stuff that does heating. There's no radar frequency until it comes off the front of the scanner. Everything below that is low voltage electrics. So who else has got a Gen 5 aeroplane? Nobody. And the great thing is, particularly actually with UK weapon systems, so the UK have got ASRAAM on this aircraft, and they will be integrating Meteor, which is the latest European weapon. The bad guys are going to get shot before they even know the JSF's there. The capability of the radar system and the range of the missile system and the signature of the aircraft, for the moment, until somebody develops anti-stealth technology, is such that they just won't know it's there before the first thing they'll know is when a missile comes inboard. Having said that, there are certain capabilities that potentially will overcome the radar stealth. So infrared search and track can give you, and as capabilities get more and more, so Rafale, the French aircraft, has an extraordinarily high capability in IRST, and the Soviet aeroplanes probably do as well. The Soviets are there. The Chinese have got a look-alike, but nobody's actually sure really how viable it is. It's some years away from being a viable contender. The Russians are probably the nearest. If they can get near it, then they can probably outmaneuver, and they certainly got a bigger weight of weapons. But this aircraft against an F-18, the kill ratio is quite often above 10 to 1. It is just that much different, that much superior in terms of its combat capability. So it's hard to see that anybody has direct opposition to it at the moment, and whoever is going to do it is going to need deep pockets. Yeah.
Well, yes, two sort of questions. What are your thoughts on Pierce Spray's criticism of the aircraft? And do you think it's a good idea to design a large 60,000-ton aircraft carrier around one particular type of aircraft? So I'm obviously referring to no cap and trap of the latest carriers.
Well, the no cat and trap, and I took that question was being asked continually. I actually personally took this programme to the main MOD Investment Appraisal Board to answer the question of Stovall versus CV 3 times. My successor did it 3, and eventually my successor but one lost the argument and went to CV for a short time. But the truth is the cost of running catapults. So Queen Elizabeth, without its air group on board, runs with about 800 people. The equivalent ship in the US Navy runs with about 4,000 people. To maintain the cats and traps would probably add 200 to 300 people to that. And the other piece is that with the tried and tested technology, which is on most of the US carriers, the very newest one has got something different, but up until now it's been steam catapults, where it's nice if you've got a nuclear kettle, but this is a gas turbine powered ship, or Queen Elizabeth is a gas turbine powered ship, so you would have to have gone to electromagnetic catapults, which are still in their infancy with the US. So it would have been a very high risk approach. The cost was certainly north of £1 billion to put catapults, extra pounds to put catapults and arrestor gear into the Queen Elizabeth. She was designed with the spaces in mind, but by the time we had a government change and then the government decided to try and change, most of those spaces have been reallocated elsewhere. But the deck is big enough for, I don't think we need it, we don't need a cat and trap aeroplane as an option there. It does limit our interoperability with the French, but there are other Stovall, so the Italians will be buying Stovall JSFs as well. And our main, if we're honest, most of the time when we're operating, our main ally will be the US, and the US Marine Corps will be operating with Queen Elizabeth even in the next few weeks. But the other piece that will be part of the air group, which will fit because the deck's big enough for free launch, is UAVs. And any of the UAVs will launch without catapults and arrestor gear. So I think the adaptability is there, and the size of the ship, the Queen Elizabeth, is just enormous. I'm used to Invincible and Ark Royal, and I've not seen them. I have seen them from distance at full size. I've seen them close up in bits, and even the bits on Queen Elizabeth were so big. When it was one of the blocks. It was so big that stood in the build shed, I could not see left and right of the fuselage without actually turning my head. It is just enormous.
Pierce Spray's criticism there?
In terms of?
Well, he called it Turkey.
Well, the kill ratios don't bear that out. If you're looking about something that's doing a burning and turning, the old days of air combat, knife fight in a telephone box, burning and turning, yes, this is going to get outturned by a Typhoon, it'll get outturned by an F-16. But the whole point of the weapon system is that you don't ever get into that position. And right now, the exercises they've done, as I say, the kill ratios against the most modern aircraft, F-15, F-16s, F-18s, are coming out minimum 4, often 10 plus to 1. That doesn't sound like a turkey to me.
Are they in ideal aircraft conditions, or Europe's not always nice and sunny like that. I mean, in rain and horrible weather. I mean, how does that affect you? So
all that materials in that technology maturation piece on technology was all about making sure that the coatings that you use to maintain the stealth are all weather coatings and easily maintainable. So you maintain the signature, which is your major advantage. And then so the mission system, you don't actually need to be able to see out. Actually, when you're looking out, what you're seeing is what the instruments and the sensors tell you. So there's no head-up display on this aircraft. Everything is on the helmet. It's just on the visor. That includes your look out the window. So if you look down through the aeroplane, down through the floor, as you're over the ship, you'll actually see the ship underneath you, despite the fact there's a floor between you and the ship. That's because it's got staring arrays all the way around. So all of those, mean that you can overcome weather. So answer is it's an all-weather aircraft.
But basically the technology and electronics of this aircraft are so good, that's where you're beating everybody.
Absolutely. It's been an interesting journey. When I was in 1999, Gen 5 was all about low observable and stealth. Now, if you talk to people about Gen 5, it's about 20% stealth and it's 80% mission systems, information, and communications. And the biggest change that the militaries that are taking this aeroplane on are having to make is actually building the infrastructure to be able to get the data off the aeroplane and use it and transmit it to its wingman.
So if the opposition invents something that picks up stealth aircraft, what does that then put the aircraft?
It's still going to be out there in terms of the mission system. It's not everything. The other alternative to stealth is speed, and it's a 1.6 aeroplane, so it can still run in and out pretty quickly. There's a lot of talk about anti-stealth technology. You need to know where the aeroplane is to actually use anti-stealth technology to try and localize it. That's down to tactics. So there's a lot of ways. I think the stealth advantage will stay for at least 15 to 20 years, if not more.
So the Boeing design, the X-32, is that just consigned to history now, no legs in that at all for maybe developing nations or something like that?
Yeah, unfortunately the two aeroplanes are parked in. I actually got to the point where one of the two aeroplanes was going to go to the Fleet Air Arm Museum, and we were all ready to actually ship it. And unfortunately, the one thing was we actually got a barge ready to take it from Pax River to Invincible that was sitting out in the river, and nobody would pay the insurance to lift it off the barge to put it on the ship, so it didn't happen. So they're actually sitting in outside museums as gate guardians, just deteriorating, which is a tragedy because they were a very, very significant piece of technology. However, what have Boeing learned from it? An awful lot of the flight control stuff that they learned, their flight control system was really, really novel. You could literally almost dial up whether you wanted to fly it as a CV aircraft or fly it as a CTOL aeroplane, almost in flight, not quite, but not far off. You could literally just change the control system gains. All of that has gone forward, and you're probably aware that Boeing have just been awarded the contract for the unmanned tanker aircraft for the carriers for the US Navy. And I've absolutely no doubt that an awful lot of the X-32 technology is embedded, and the learning about LO is embedded in those aircraft. So the X-32 itself is dead and gone, but the learning has survived in Boeing.
What will be the size of the Fleet Air Arm fleet, and will they be based at Yeovil?
So there is the final total buy for the UK is planned to be 148, I think, aircraft, and but it's going to be a completely joint asset. So whilst there will be two squadrons that have Fleet Air Arm numbers and two squadrons that have RAF numbers, the manning of both squadrons will be exactly the same mix of Air Force and Navy pilots, and the commanding officers of each of those squadrons will alternate between Navy and Air Force, whether it's an Air Force squadron or a Navy. The level of joint activity, when you get to the sort of seniority that I was at in the Navy, you still get people nagging at each other. Actually, when you get down to the people that are operating the aeroplane, they're completely used to operating in a completely joint environment. So the bottom line is there will be 4 squadrons for the UK capable of deploying to whatever the priority is, whether that's the carrier or whether that's land operations. One of the great beauties about Stovall, if you have a CV aircraft, you almost need to keep a squadron on board the whole time to maintain the currency of both the deck crews, because you can see there's a lot of people involved. You really have to orchestrate deck operations to keep them safe, which means you need to be doing it all the time. Stovall is a much safer, intrinsically more safer, particularly with the ski jump, safer operation, and you can afford. You get a bit rusty, so you need to have a little bit of work-up time, but you can afford not to have large numbers of aircraft deployed the whole time purely for training purposes. You can actually, because a Stovall landing at an airbase on a pad is almost the same as landing on board a carrier, particularly a big one like this. So that's it is absolutely a joint asset.
And apart from Marham, where will they be based?
It will be based at Marham.
Oh,
Yeah. There will be one base, and they'll deploy from there to the carriers or to wherever else they need to go.
Another quick question. Why was the GE Rolls-Royce variant cancelled when it was so close to...
Dirty politics. I think I probably better not say anything more than that, but it was some very dirty politics. There was undoubtedly, it would have been a longer term, very good investment, but there was some pretty sharp practice played.
What can you tell us about the actual weapons capability of this airplane? It seems to have two outboard wing bombers.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Possibly with a missile on each. That doesn't seem a lot of weapons.
No, and as soon as you do that, you've now compromised the signature, which may be why they've got them on. It may be that you don't want to fly around in LO configuration in peacetime. I don't know. I'm guessing. I saw that today. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I see they've got outboard weapons on, or it could be just for training purposes. So the weapons are carried internally. On the Stovall aeroplane, it's two 1,000-pound class guided precision weapons and one AMRAAM or two ASRAAMs, if you do it. So one long-range weapon or two medium-range or short-range weapons, all internally. They're a bit more difficult to practice with, though. So that might be the other reason they've got these on. These are probably winders with an IR head, so the pilots can actually practice acquiring targets. Because what happens is, if you've got an air-to-air engagement with the internal weapon, you actually have to use the mission system to lock onto the aeroplane, and then at the last minute, the door is open, weapon comes out on a trapeze and just goes. So you don't have the weapon actually picking up in the way that you're used to if you're there. So the CV and the CTOL class, one of the bits where they're not common, they have a bigger weapons bay, and they can carry two 1,000 class weapons per side, and that's just purely a weight issue. And these days, we're at the point where it absolutely, particularly with this mission system, it's one target, one weapon. That's all you need. You know that target is going to go within about a few inches of where you want it to go. So, we're very definitely into low collateral damage, precision attack, and increasingly now, to maintain that low collateral damage, they don't even use 1,000-pound class weapons because they make too big a bang. So you'll generally use a 600-pound small smart weapon, and you can get two of those into the bay. So it's still got a good capability, and that's just day one when you're stealthy. Once you've taken the air defences down, you can put pylons on it and load it up like a bomb truck, so as everything else. So then you've got a very capable weapons carriage platform.
When the aircraft in the hover, is control roll your pitch purely a feed by movement of a real number?
No, it's got it's very Harrier-like for the rest of it, but just a bit larger scale. So if you know anything about the Harrier, it's got the ducts out to the tips of the wings and one to the front. Well, pitch, you just do it by varying thrust between the lift fan and the nozzle and the back nozzle. Roll has got the ducts that are about that big, and unlike the Harrier nozzles about this big, the JSF one's this sort of size. So there are shutters on the wingtips that do the roll control. And your control is actually by moving the aft nozzle swivels laterally as well as in the vertical plane.
Right, and do they come into effect like the Harrier when the nozzle is selected downward?
Yes, but not quite in the same way. So on a Harrier, it's purely designed, it's linked to the nozzle position, which is very, very manual. So the joy of the UK design control system, it's a bit too involved, but there is an issue with a Harrier control system. So when a Harrier is up and away and flying, you've essentially got two controls. You've got a throttle and a stick. And when you're away flying, houses get bigger, houses get smaller, go fast, go slow. When you come to hover in a Harrier, those two controls are switched over. When you're sitting in the hover, you want to move forward, it's stick, forward, backwards. If you want to go up and down, it's throttle, And a number of Harrier losses occurred because there's a transition between those two as you're coming and transitioning from forward flight into the hover. And pilots get confused as to which effector is doing which. So the JSF system is designed that that logic stays the whole way through. And it's all done, so basically, and if people who fly Harriers liken it to bouncing on a beach ball, a Harrier is really unstable in the hover. This thing, you actually select hover, and you select hover by going, you turn it into solo mode, so the airplane goes like, I know you want to go solo. You pull the throttle back to select 0 speed, and you take the hands off, and the aircraft will bring itself, do all the nozzles, the doors, the whole works, and bring itself to hover. You can hover hands off. And then when you want to go down, it's still stick forward, and the aircraft goes down. Stick up, and then the throttle is effectively a nudge to move you forward and back. So that logic remains right the way through, but it's entirely hands-free. So it was actually developed at Boscombe Down in a twin-seat Harrier that had JSF controls in the back and conventional controls in the front, which meant they didn't have to ever certify the JSF controls while they were doing the testing, because you could always revert to the conventional controls of the guy in the front. And I know a number of people who had never flown a solo aeroplane before, F-16, F-18 pilots. They got in the Vark carrier and they were hovering it first time out. It's just an incredible piece of capability, and it's kinetic and BA Systems that developed that. And it's a massive, massive step forward in terms of the usability of the aeroplane.
Make quite a difference in pilot training.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no twin seat. You don't, whereas the Harrier, you had to have a twin seat to teach people hover. There's no twin seat there. They go straight from the simulator into the airplane.
Thank you.
When you see the collateral damage on the news media in the Middle East, Syria and so on, do you think that's the state of the art, or do you think it's better?
Can I defer that one as a political statement? I'd rather it may be accidental. There's a third bit which is maybe accidental. No plane ever survives contact with the enemy. But I think I'd stop at that if I may.
You mentioned low speed for the standard US engine version.
Yeah.
Roughly what would be the VREF there?
110 knots airspeed, which if the ship's doing 20 is about 90 knots running. And it has to be compatible with F-18 because they will be. The US Navy have got new F-18Gs, and you can't have two aircraft in the same pattern flying different speeds, so you had to get the speed right down. It was one of the reasons why in very early days, there was quite a strong look for the UK, could we actually marinise Typhoon? And we could never get, although Typhoon actually has got enough power to get off the deck without a catapult, you could never get it back on again. Or if you did, you couldn't stop it.
You mentioned, if I heard you correctly, say that you've still got 20,000 pounds thrust out of the back end.
Yeah.
What's that being used for?
Well, it's
20,000 pounds down.
No, you've got 40,000 pounds down, because it's 20,000 at the back is directed downwards as well.
Misunderstood.
So you've got 40,000 pounds of lift. Yeah.
How much of the project is on the kind of less exciting, but was aircraft engineers know equally important bit of provisioning reliability versus maintainability, three very different types, operating by nobody being able to afford a whole suite of everything presumably was there. So how's the project addressed that?
Well, firstly, interestingly, the boss of Marham was saying last week, every aeroplane the UK is buying has got every bit of kit on it, which is almost the first. You know, I think of the Tornado fleet of 100 and something aeroplanes, there were about 8 that were fully mission capable for the ultimate mission. That's not the case with F-35. Every aircraft is fitted. But there is a very, very significant investment in that logistics support piece. So I actually was the deputy lead for logistics for the Americans when I was actually working in the office, and I wrote the support concept for it. And it starts with the fact that the aeroplane is incredibly intelligent in terms of doing it. So there's a lot of built-in prognostics, health management, which it then, when it comes out of stealth mode and it's coming back to the ship, it transmits back to make sure that it tells you what state it's coming back in, therefore what spares are required. There's a single logistics support network run by the prime contractor, which provides spares on a global basis. It's got regional depots, so avionics support for the whole of Europe is being done by the MOD's establishment up in North Wales. So they're doing all of the European, the Italians, the Dutch, the UK, Belgians if they buy the aircraft. The engines are all being done in the Netherlands because Pratt & Whitney have got bases there. So they've localised so that you can hold the spares in the right place. The reliability is extremely good so far, really, really good. I only know about the lift fan, and apart from they had a couple of quality issues, the nozzles actually, the power to move the nozzles is fuel, not hydraulic. There's no ring main hydraulics on this aeroplane. And they had a couple of problems with quality on the fuel hoses, so they had one burst, which is a bit embarrassing. But other than that, the reliability of the main components is really, really good. So the dispatch reliability is right there. At the moment, it's cost. And there's a big, big drive going across all the nations, led by the US Air Force, who've got most airplanes at the moment, to get cost out. And I'm absolutely sure, having been, when we were doing production, I was challenged to take 40% out of the cost of the lift system. And we achieved it. And so I'm absolutely sure that with the pressures and the skills they've got there, they will get that cost out. So it's getting there, and there's a very, very large team. And it was always there it's as important as the operational capability of the aircraft in making sure the logistics system is capable as well.
Could we make the next one the last question, please?
I'm going to go for the back if I may. Sorry. I'll take two. I'll take you in a minute. Yeah.
It's quite a simple question. It's a what-if question. So what if, for whatever reason, Boeing won the contract and the X-32 is going to be going? How would that affect the air superiority of the UK and the US? And how would that affect the aviation world in general?
I don't know. I think once the aircraft was airborne, assuming they got to the point where they actually sorted out an intake that would work in Stowell and supersonic, and I'm sure they would do so, it would be quite complicated because it would have to be translated somehow. Assuming they got past the taking off and landing bit, the aircraft, once it was airborne, would have had more or less the same capabilities. The one thing I would say, though, I think what Boeing demonstrated was that direct lift had reached the limits of its capability in terms of the size of the aircraft. So a Harrier is typically 20,000 pounds, 17,000 pounds when it's landing. This is much more a 30, 35,000 pound aircraft. Direct lift creates an extremely unfriendly environment. The great thing about the Lockheed system is it's effectively a variable cycle engine. When you switch the clutch in, or clutch in the fan, you're taking a huge amount of power off the turbine. So the energy that's coming, energy that's coming out of the back of the engine is much quieter and has lower pressure. And that actually makes for a much more friendly environment. Having spent 4 years of my life on board carriers, working around Harriers, which is why I'm a bit deaf, that was actually a really critical environment, and it was really difficult to see how a direct lift solution was going to provide a human-friendly environment on board a ship. But once the aircraft was airborne, I've absolutely no doubt. That Boeing have got the F-18, they've got the F-18G now coming into service. They're just as capable as Lockheed in terms of producing a world-beating combat aircraft. They probably just chose the wrong concept for how to get it on and off the deck. One more here.
The US Navy has a lot of carriers, and they have a layered defence system.
Yeah.
On board a big carrier, you've got the Hawkeyes and the whole range of protective systems.
Yeah.
And apparently the Soviets now have a genuine stealthy submarines with a different propulsion system, whatever. So
yeah.
How does all that work together? Because we have, we don't have that cross section of.
Well, actually we do. We've got the Type 45 destroyer is probably the most capable when the engines work. And I speak in Hector's voices for you. When the engines work, Type 45 is probably the most capable air warfare destroyer in the world. The radar system on that is incredible. So that the area that sanitising the airspace using a Type 45 destroyer with a C-sector weapon system, and we're just about to get Crow's Nest, the Merlin version of the airborne early warning aircraft. So those layers are coming in place for the UK. And the submarine warfare for the UK, good question. Our ships are getting old, the 23s are old, and we haven't been practicing anti-submarine, and we have not had significant investment. The Russians are now coming out in force in submarines, and it's a big, big focus for the Royal Navy right now. And it's getting ourselves back current. We do have very capable anti-submarine aircraft, once you know roughly where the submarine is, but what you need is a towed RAeS to actually know, to try and get the area where the submarine is. So that layering is there. It's by no means as comprehensive as the Americans, but there's every reason why we will operate this ship in conjunction with the Americans. Actually now, for the first time, we will probably, and it's part of policy, we will substitute for an American carrier because our power projection capability is right up with what the Americans can do. So if they can't actually provide a carrier, it may be they provide the escort force and we plug the carrier gap. And that's all, crystal nil as far as I'm concerned. That's how you get good value out of your defence money.
Okay. Right, I'm going to do this slightly unconventional and say thank you all for coming. I'm sure you've all enjoyed what's happened here tonight. Simon, thank you very much indeed for coming and giving up your time. We have a little gizzit, which I'm sure you'll enjoy.
Thank you.
From across the globe, from the centre of aerospace. And now to you.
Thank you for downloading from the Royal Aeronautical Society. If you enjoyed this content, please consider showing your support for the Society. Share a link to this presentation by email or on your favourite social networks. If you have an interest in aerospace, consider the professional and personal benefits of membership. Visit www.aerosociety.com.